Hey everyone, it's Brooks Pritchett, your instructor. I thought I would make a couple quick videos on each of the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, just to give you a better idea of how they're classified and some good food sources of each of these macronutrients. So I'm going to start off with carbohydrates, and unfortunately carbohydrates are getting a really bad rap right now. Everybody's going on these low carb diets, carbs are bad, and it's not so much that carbs are bad, they're really not. There's plenty of nutrient dense carbohydrates out there that I want you to choose and want you to consume regularly. Unfortunately, in our country, we're typically getting a lot of the wrong types of carbohydrates, a lot of added sugars, refined grains, and we're eating very large quantities of them. So like I said, carbs aren't bad, so hopefully I can give you some good suggestions of some better carbohydrates to eat. So to kick it off, we classify carbohydrates, or I should say there's two main categories of carbohydrates. We have our simple sugars and then our complex carbohydrates. And simple sugars are broken down into mono and disaccharides, as you'll see over here on this concept map, which is available to you here on D2L. And monosaccharides are our simplest form of carbohydrates. It's just one little sugar molecule. And the three monosaccharides that we find in food are glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then each of these monosaccharides will combine with another monosaccharide to form a disaccharide, so di to mono one. And the three disaccharides that we have are maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Some of you may know that sucrose is actually table sugar and lactose is the type of sugar that we find in milk. And like I said before, most of the sugars that we get in our diet are typically not from the most nutrient-dense foods. They're typically from, sodas, sweets, not the best types of sugar. But there's plenty of nutrient-dense foods that do contain natural sugars. So for example, fruits and vegetables and dairy products, I would definitely want you to consume those just because they're chock full of so many good nutrients. And then limit your intake of all those foods with added sugar. So if you want to know if a food has added sugar, unfortunately it's not going to list that on the nutrition facts label under sugars. You need to go down to the ingredients list and actually look for words like sugar, dextrose, glucose, typically anything that ends with an OSE, cane syrup, corn sugar, high fructose corn syrup. That typically means that a food has sugar added to it. So switching over from simple sugars, we get into our bigger molecules of carbohydrates, and these are going to be our complex carbohydrates. And the two types of carbohydrates that we get from food are starch and fiber. I'll get to glycogen here in just a minute. Starch is our digestible form of carbohydrates. These are those long chains of carbohydrates that our body can break down and use for fuel. And there's two types of starch that you'll find in foods, and that's amylose and amylopectin. And if you think of foods that are high in starch, there's quite a wide variety. If you think, first of all, your starchy vegetables, things like potatoes, beans, peas, corn. Just because a food is starchy doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for you. Potatoes, for example, are getting such a bad rap right now, but potatoes are actually a great source of potassium and B vitamins and fiber. They offer a wealth of nutrition. Usually with potatoes, we're eating huge potatoes loaded with sour cream and butter and bacon, which are generally foods that we might want to limit. Other foods that are high in starch will be your whole grains, or grains in general, so wheat, rye, quinoa, rice, barley, oats, foods like that. Our next category of complex carbohydrates is going to be fiber. And fiber is the non-digestible form of carbohydrates, meaning we don't have the enzymes to actually break them down and yield energy from them. And the two types of fiber that you'll find in foods are soluble and insoluble fiber. Most of us know insoluble fiber is basically roughage. It just gets foods moving through you. You'll find insoluble fiber in foods like bran, a lot of fruits and vegetables, whole grains. That's the best type of fiber if you're trying to stay regular. Soluble fiber is great because it helps with lowering the bad cholesterol in our blood. It helps keep our blood sugar more stable. It helps fill us up and keeps us fuller longer. And foods that are high in soluble fiber are going to be things like oats, whether it's rolled oats or a cereal like Cheerios. You'll also find them in certain fruits and vegetables like beans, lentils, apples and pears. And most foods out there that are high in complex carbohydrates are going to be a mix of soluble and insoluble fiber. So if you think of like an apple, for instance, the skin on the apple is going to be that insoluble fiber, whereas that inside is going to be more of the soluble fiber. So that's why it always is a benefit to eat the skin on foods like apples, pears, and even potatoes. Now, when we come over here to glycogen, glycogen is essentially human starch. That's our storage form of carbohydrates, and we store glycogen in our liver and muscles. And this is what helps provide us, or helps keep our blood sugar stable in between meals, or can serve as a reserve of carbohydrates, for out exercising, for instance. And when it comes to complex carbohydrates as a whole, like I said before, a lot of times carbs are getting, well, I should say carbs are getting a pretty bad rap right now, and we're trying to watch starchy foods and be careful with our carbohydrate choices. And really, the key is just moderation. I definitely want you to include starchy vegetables and whole grains in your diet. But if you're being mindful of your weight, just be careful about how much whole grain pasta you eat, or how much cereal you eat, or how big your potato is, or how big a portion of peas you put on your plate. Just be mindful of that. Maybe you opt to stick more with the non-starchy vegetables, things like broccoli and spinach. And other leafy greens, tomatoes, onions. Those don't have as much of the starch in them. Starch isn't a bad thing at all. People are just very anti-carb right now. So hopefully that helped better answers any questions you have on carbohydrates and how they're divided up. I'm also going to post a couple articles that I think might come in handy that I've shared with some of my face-to-face classes. And like I said, these concept maps will be available to you as well. So if you have any questions on anything, please let me know. And definitely check out the other videos that I have for fat and protein.